The painting on your screen should look quite new to you, radical, revolutionary, compared to the paintings we've seen so far. Like the history paintings of Angelica Kauffman, this is a multi-figure work, right? There's a crowd congregated in the lower right-hand corner of the canvas. But most of the painting is dedicated to the sky, to nature, to the landscape. That should signal, right, the growing importance of landscape that we've seen in our discussion of John Constable. But unlike Constable paintings, we don't have the precision of paint that would identify the type of leaf on the tree on the right-hand corner of this painting or meteorological specificity. Instead, Turner focuses on atmosphere, and his paint doesn't describe with precision. Joseph Mallord William Turner's was Constable's contemporary, and Constable said of him, "He is uncouth, but what a wonderful range of mind." Turner was born the son of a barber and wig maker, and remained a Londoner and kept a Cockney accent all his life, avoiding the veneer of social polish acquired by many artists of the time, think Reynolds, Gainsborough, Constable, as they climbed the professional ladder. So he really maintained a working class identity. At home, his father encouraged his artistic talent and showed off his drawings in his barber shop. In December 1789, after a term's probation, Turner entered the Royal Academy Schools, where he progressed from the Plaster Academy, right, drawing from the casts of ancient sculpture. You've seen this before when we discussed Angelica Kauffman's education, to the life drawing class in 1792, right, classes that Kauffman did not have access to. He augmented his studies with other work experience, with architects and architectural draftsmen, including Thomas Mountain, who he later described as my real master, and painted scenery for London stage productions. Turner's varied activities indicate wide interests as well as a need to fund his academy education. The flourishing market for landscape and topographical views, often related to tourism, whether watercolors for exhibition and sale or reproduction in prints and books, remember our discussion of the picturesque from last class, provided his first real income. Early trips outside London, including a visit to friends of his at Bristol in 1791, alerted him to the value of sketching on the spot as the basis of studio and commercial work. And he seems to have thought of having his views on the Avon George, which you see here, published in prints. These views earned him the nickname for a time, the Prince of the Rocks. At this moment, Turner worked in the same circle as Gertrin, that topographical watercolorist that you were first introduced to last class. From the mid-1790s, he settled on a routine he would maintain for much of his life, touring in the summer and working in his studio in the winter months. The post-revolutionary wars in Europe confined his first tours to his home country, traveling in England and Scotland rather than on the European continent. And we can see, right, the connection between Turner's early work and Gilpin's watercolors in terms of the idea of the picturesque, right? We have serpentine lines, especially in these rivers carving through a rural space. We have sort of scraggy trees, a diverse landscape, right? There's grasses and bushes and trees, no clear views onto, massive man-made monuments. In Gerton's work, we have the ruins of an abbey, but this isn't a celebration of man's achievement or sort of domination of nature, but instead a kind of tourist's meandering view. The valuing a kind of wildness and paths of discovery. Turner would show his works at the Royal Academy beginning in 1790, showing only watercolors until 1796, when he sent his first oil painting, Fisherman at Sea, that you see on your screen. Its marine subject signaled a wider ambitions as a painter and his refusal to be typecast as a topographical painter. And this is a kind of strange subject, right? This is a nocturnal seascape. There's a sense of the overwhelming power of nature, which is a key theme with the idea of the sublime. The theory of the sublime in art was, again, a very specific kind of idea at this moment in the late 18th century. It was put forward by Edmund Burke in A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, published in 1757. I've included this lengthy title on your screen. And the sublime is an idea that excites images of pain and danger, a kind of terrible feeling, terror, right? Terror, fear, were believed by Burke and others to be the kind of strongest emotions the mind is capable of feeling, right? That pain is stronger than pleasure. To make a thing terrible, obscurity is necessary. These are some of the same principles operating in the sublime as we see used in a lot of, kind of horror films today, right? That art was supposed to stir up emotion and the sort of the strongest emotions are fear, are terror, and that can often be caused by more by what's hidden, right, than by what's revealed. So there's this idea operating, the idea of the sublime operating here, partially through the greatness of the dimension, right? One of the reasons the sea is such a scary place is its dimension, its sense of infinity, right? That can inspire the kind of terror here. Burke defined the sublime as an artistic effect, producing the strongest emotion the mind is capable of feeling. He wrote that whatever is in any sort terrible or conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror is a source of the sublime. The landscape in the sublime, the sublime is exemplified by Turner's sea storms and mountain scenes. The notion that a legitimate function of art can be to produce sort of upsetting or disturbing effects was an important element in capital R romantic art that would emerge around this time and remains really fundamental to some art today. Again, think not only horror films, but also even the idea of the sublime is conjured with images of the Grand Canyon or movies that take place on the sea or at the site of a plane crash, things like that. And here in Fisherman at Sea, the potency of the moonlight contrasts with the delicate vulnerability of the flickering lantern, emphasizing nature's power over mankind and the fisherman's fate in particular. The jagged silhouettes on the left are treacherous rocks called the Needles off the Isle of Wight in England. Again, you would not want to run into rocks, right? Fishing at night. So we need to think about Burke's idea of the sublime operating in some of Turner's landscapes. In the years following his debut as a painter at the Royal Academy, he exhibited diverse genres of painting. History painting, more landscape paintings, challenging the styles of not only the old masters, but showing a technique that would really pose a challenge to the tastes of the Academy and sort of traditional painters of his day. The Royal Academy's president, Benjamin West, denounced the views of the Thames exhibited in Turner's gallery, like this, the Thames near Windsor, as crude blotches. Turner and other artists associated with him were called white painters because of their use of these sort of luminous and sometimes pale tones. This wasn't a great designation, not one of his worst. Sir George Beaumont, a fashionable arbiter of taste during Turner's time, was particularly hostile to the artist. He thought Turner debased old masters like the 17th century landscape painter Claude Lorraine. So Turner was not well liked or accepted during his lifetime. He grew used to controversy and even courted it sometimes. Despite his earlier frictions, he remained really fiercely loyal to the Academy, once referring to it as the mother of artists. In 1808, he was very happy to be appointed as the Royal Academy's professor of perspective, having proposed himself when the post was hard to fill. And he was really proud of his job as a professor at the Academy, sometimes adding PP to his after his signature on paintings. So Turner was not a reactionary. He did not have this desire to work outside the Academy despite his radically different approach. Again, we'll see something very different with, say, the French Impressionists later in the century, who would go outside of the bounds of their own Academy in France after their techniques were rejected. So Beaumont thought Turner debased old masters like Claude Lorraine, but Turner was looking to 17th century landscape quite closely. He emulated Claude Lorraine in the early years of his career, as you can see with his painting Carthage from 1815. He looked to Lorraine and other 17th century landscape painters in an ambition to elevate landscape painting in the Royal Academy. So by using these sort of classical examples. The later phase, his more radical phase, will begin in the 1830s, where his painting will become more wild, right, more atmospheric and virtuosic. It'll become looser, drawing not the appreciation necessarily of the leaders of the Royal Academy, but certainly the public. In Turner's The Field of Waterloo, we see the artist tackling a history painting, the genre of history painting, right? A multi-figure painting capturing an important historical event. But in 1818, Turner is tackling a very recent historical event. So not from biblical or mythological history, but Waterloo, right, was a battle that took place in 1815 and saw Britain and Prussia defeat Napoleon's French armies, putting an end to the Napoleonic Wars that had ravaged Europe up until that moment for nearly a decade. Turner visited the battlefield at Waterloo, already a tourist attraction in 1817, and he filled a sketchbook with drawings and notes and later made studies of soldiers' uniforms in preparation for this painting. In it, Turner emphasizes the war's tragic consequences for all of its victims. So one could imagine this being a really sort of a moment of soaring nationalism, but in Turner's hands, this battle scene is more modern and humane, and it's mingling of dead on all sides here. He also accompanied this painting with an epigraph from the famous Waterloo stanzas by Byron's recently published poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. As a reflection of recent events, this painting stood in total contrast to pictures of the rise and fall of ancient Carthage. His greatest Claudian, or in the pattern of Claude Lorraine, works exhibited in 1815 and 1817. These works on Carthage allegorize the collapse of Napoleon's empire, but through an example from sort of deeper historical memory, right? So he's exploring Napoleon's downfall, but through the story of the decline of the Carthaginian Empire, which was exhibited in 1817. So where have we seen an image of the British thinking about or expressing anxieties about civilization's collapse before? Of course, we've seen this before with Hogarth, right? The British thinking about civilization, past civilization's collapse as a means of exploring contemporary anxieties or even celebrations about empires collapsing in their own day, right? Turner is representing the fall of Carthage to explore, and Carthage was a commercial center that was defeated by the Roman Republic. So a kind of happy collapse in the 7th century BCE. The 2nd century BCE, sorry guys. Here, right, Hogarth is worried about the collapse of the British Empire and his worry is shown by the exploration, the reference to the collapse of the Roman Empire. So that would be an unhappy collapse. So we've seen artists meditate, right, on large historical events or transitions before by thinking through sort of ancient examples. We see this notion of history, but also the sublime at work in Turner's Snowstorm, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps of 1812, right? This, of course, is a vision of the sublime, a painting that represents an epic and sort of roaring nature, right? Sort of terrifying nature. The sky is 80 or 90% of this painting, right? And the weather, the sort of natural forces are exaggerated and disorienting. It's really hard to read, right, anything about Hannibal or his army here because we're so awed and distracted by the storm and the mountains and natural forces here. The general and his troops are dwarfed, right, by the overwhelming scale of the landscape and engulfed in this swirling vortex of snow. And this embodies, again, the romantic sensibility of the sublime in landscape painting. And for Turner, the figure of Hannibal, here leading his armies over the Alps to attack Italy, had powerful associations with Napoleon, again, who wouldn't be defeated until 1815. Both of these works, and you've seen Thomas Rowlandson, the Corsican Spider, in his web before, meditate on Napoleon's territorial expansions, of course, through different ways. In Rowlandson's caricature, the metaphor of the animal, the sort of primal hunger of the arachnid, communicates that the fear of European countries around, right, being tackled by this French army as the various flies are ensnared. So the web in Rowlandson's hands acts as a kind of geography, right, presents a narrative about Napoleon's military ambitions, about his march through Europe. In Turner's hands, he shows the same kind of anxieties or fear, right, amplified through the chaos of natural forces, right? The sublime inspires fear, right, through obscurity and vastness. So the Snowstorm doesn't celebrate the power of the individual, but expresses man's vulnerability in the face of nature's overwhelming force. Hannibal, the leader of this army, is not actually pictured in Turner's work, and attention is focused upon the victims of the conflict, these soldiers that are struggling, right, against nature's forces. Thomas Lawrence became Benjamin West's successor as the president of the Royal Academy in January 1830. Lawrence liked Turner. He judged him indisputably the first landscape painter in Europe. And not long before his death, Turner had an endowed chair and a gold medal for landscape paintings at the Royal Academy. Turner's public status was reflected, too, in his choice of subjects and exhibited work. While he continued to show historical and classical subjects, right, drawing from the stories of Hannibal and Carthage, these by the 1830s were deemed sort of old-fashioned. So he was also highly responsive to contemporary subjects, especially those that marked a transition from the past. In 1834, he grasped at once the pictorial power and national symbolism of the burning of the Houses of Parliament, happening as it did just 2 years after the sweeping Reform Bill of 1832, which changed the national political landscape. Here is one of these works, one of these paintings, The Burning of the Houses of Parliament, which you can see, of course, on the left-hand side, with the crowds amassed. This might not be visible immediately. The crowds amassed in the foreground, watching the burning of this national landmark and political institutional space, much as many of us did on January 6th, watch the storming of our Capitol. And here I'm showing you 3 watercolor sketches that Turner made for that painting. He watched the blaze actually from a boat on the Thames, boats that you can see in the painting on the slide before. And he made a series of color studies before sending a picture to the Royal Academy. These watercolors are relatively thin in their distribution of pigments, right, in order to capture the kind of translucence of water, right, the water which reflected the fire and smoke that billowed above. So he's through watercolor really capturing the effects of mist and smoke and water. And this is pretty incredible because, as some of you might know, right, once you make a mistake in watercolor, it's permanent, unlike oil painting. So these are captured quickly and with the kind of immediacy of pigment that can't be adjusted. And he is, this is a great subject, the burning of Parliament, for an artist interested in the sublime, right, in subjects that are communicating passion and danger and obscurity and terror. No other artist was attempting such definitive renderings of the emergent modern world, its moral preoccupations of slavery or machine labor, the burning of Parliament, the invention of steamships and railways, nor doing it with such panache and sense of theater as Turner. So he was an incredibly contemporary artist, it's important to know. We see this interest in the emergent modern world, especially in Turner's painting Rain, Steam, and Speed, the Great Western Railway of 1844, a painting he showed at the Royal Academy. This was a moment, the 1840s, when railways were brand new, a brand new way of connecting cities and people. And the train became a really potent symbol of industrialization, right? Turning movement, the fastest you could move before a train was on horse. Movement had become mechanized, right? Time changed to this kind of industrial scale. And Turner's painting captures the feeling of the speed of a train coming towards us, right? It's kind of a confrontational painting. We're not watching the train at a distance, but it's charging towards us, right, as we stand close to the railway. We can also, as the viewer, really feel the wetness of the day. Carriages on the train were open at this moment, so passengers were exposed to the atmosphere, so it really mattered whether it was raining to you on a train. And I want you to just think for a moment about the speed at which people had traveled throughout history up until this point, right? The speed at which you could experience the world was on foot or by horse. And so for the first time, people were transported mechanically. This is something we're quite used to now, right? Traveling in cars or on planes. But this was really revolutionary in the early 19th century. And it felt both exciting but also, quite violent to be the passenger of this hulking iron monster. And Turner shows this kind of contrast. There's a farmer in the corner of this painting, sort of leaping out of... the farmer's not leaping. A symbol of agricultural England, and that's sort of at odds with industrial England. On the right side of the painting, this is a little bit hard to see. I'm going to draw a little arrow next to it. There's a rabbit. He's the one leaping out of the way. A rabbit, of course, the former symbol of speed, is being replaced in a really dramatic fashion. There's also a contrast Turner makes between two kinds of bridges, right? A bridge of the past, you have this kind of arched bridge reminiscent of Roman aqueducts. On the left-hand side of the painting, which is set into contrast with this new Maidenhead railway bridge. So the past and the present. Turner also paints this in a very modern way, with thick impasto paint applied with a palette knife. And it's so abstract, right? Many passages in the painting are unreadable as anything specific, right? Look at this passage of paint just to the left of the train itself in sort of tan. It's hard to read what that is. And though this painting is about a train, about 3/4 of the canvas is dedicated to representing water and atmosphere, sort of non-specific forms. The only form with real clarity is the black chimney on the front of the train. So as much as this is about modern technologies, rain, steam, and speed is also about the act of painting, right? Painting both quickly and in this modern fashion. Unlike Constable, right, we see Turner here capturing landscapes that are subject to industrialization, that are capturing the forces of industrialization. The steam of the train becomes unified with the haze of the natural environment. The landscape dissolves into the fragile texture of light and paint. So this is a painting about industry cutting through a landscape in a forward rush. Critics of Turner's said that he had a, quote, diseased eye and reckless hand, and that he suffered from chromomania, in other words, an insanity around colors. Turner knew, right, that he was perhaps not going to be understood by his public. He wrote in a letter to Reverend Kingsley, "I did not paint to be understood, and it's no one's business to like his pictures." This is the sort of definition of an avant-garde artist, a term that's thrown around a lot, but emerges from military language. So it means sort of ahead, before the force. So avant-garde means that artists are pushing the boundaries of taste and style, but to a point where they're not understood or admired in their own life. Turner's paintings in the 1840s seemed indistinct, almost inappropriate for public exhibition. There were a lot of nasty words written about Turner, and a lot of that emerged from this sense of abstraction, right? The abstraction of his compositions, this sense that you don't know what you're looking at in every sort of passage or pixel of the painting. Instead, he's creating these sort of sublime effects that we are, as viewers, almost as overwhelmed or suffering from the same fears of obscurity as some of the figures in his paintings. And this kind of abstraction seems quite normal to us now, right, as 21st century viewers, especially viewers after Impressionism. This is more than 2 decades before any Impressionist artists painted as they did, and they were reviled in their own time in France. So Turner pushed the envelope in ways where it's very hard to describe or capture to you, the 21st century viewer. He did have some advocates. John Ruskin, probably the most famous 19th century art critic, was a big defender of Turner's. In the first volume of his book, Modern Painters, he included Turner at the beginning. But most critics, right, kind of tried to outdo each other, accused Turner of extravagance and exaggeration, comparing his pictures to lobster salad, soap suds and whitewash, beetroot and mustard. But Ruskin rooted his analysis in Turner's truth to nature. He became the standard bearer of a new generation of Turner admirers. Usually professional, middle class, or newly rich, so not the established aristocracy. People who were willing to embrace Turner's work for its modern perspective. Their enthusiasm for his watercolors and oils brought an upsurge of work in the medium in the last decade of Turner's life. So he found this kind of new audience there. Turner's modern perspective is also evident in this moving painting, The Slave Ship, or Slavers Overthrowing the Overboard, the Dead and Dying, from 1840. John Ruskin was actually the first owner of this painting, and he wrote, quote, "If I were reduced to rest Turner's immortality upon any single work, I should choose this." This painting from 1840 represents an event from the 1780s when British slaveholders, slave traders, threw 6 slaves overboard in order to collect insurance damages. So they had insured these human beings as property, right, legally, and they threw them into the sea, let them drown in order to collect the insurance money. This horrifying, obviously, right, horrifying moment in Turner's hands, right, focuses on the raging sea, right, and the landscape. It's as if nature is taking on the inhumanity of the institution of slavery. The landscape becomes a kind of history painting. And I don't mean the genre of landscape, I mean the sea and sky here, right, take on the narrative qualities of history. He exhibited this painting at the Royal Academy exhibition in 1840. Again, before slavery was universally accepted as an immoral enterprise. So Turner was ahead of his time in terms of technique, but also of the ethics here. And you can see, it's quite moving, you can see a shackled limb, right, emerging from the sea in the bottom right-hand corner of the painting, and some shackles around. This painting was also exhibited with a group of works at the Tate Modern in 1906, 55 years after Turner's death. And in an exhibition that presented Turner as an avant-garde artist, right, especially the ways that he abstracted, the degree to which he abstracted his landscapes was finally accepted after so long as really ahead of its time. Today, there's a Turner Prize in Britain for contemporary art. So again, showing Turner's avant-garde or revolutionary status in the history of British art. And his late paintings are radical and modern, again, not just in paint, but in their attitude. Though he came out of the hallowed landscape traditions, the classical landscape traditions of Claude Lorraine, we see in Turner a critical contribution to landscape paintings as this path-breaking genre of 19th century British art.